Don't trust the gentle appearance of Jane Seymour. She was the only woman who ever managed to tame the monster inside Henry VIII. Jane accomplished what no woman before her had achieved. She gave the king a legitimate male heir, and she made the tyrant weep, wearing black mourning clothes for nearly 3 consecutive months. But what was the price of becoming the only beloved wife? 12 days after giving birth, she was gone, leaving behind a mystery that has lasted for centuries. Was Jane a saint who sacrificed herself, or the woman who held the final psychological card in her hands? Let us begin to decode this story right now. In May 1536, London was dressed in the radiance of spring, yet behind the stone walls of Whitehall Palace, the air was thick with an unnamed mourning. Only days after the French executioner's sword had ended the life of Anne Boleyn on May 19, 1536, the palace fell into a strange psychological state. A false sense of relief spread across pale faces. Laughter echoed too loudly through the banquet halls, as if to drown out the whispers about the soul of the falcon whose wings had just been broken. Tapestries embroidered with the intertwined initials H and A, Henry and Anne, were hastily torn down, leaving blotched walls that looked like wounds not yet healed. Amid that silent turmoil, Jane Seymour appeared like morning mist, blurred, cool, and frighteningly still. Unlike the sharp, suffocating allure of Anne, Jane was her complete opposite. She did not possess fiery dark eyes. Instead, she had pale blue eyes like a winter lake, always lowered in humility. If Anne had been a vibrant, defiant melody, Jane was a prolonged silence in the middle of a political symphony. Jane abandoned the bright silks of French fashion. She favored cream white, ash gray, and high-necked lace that concealed her body. Jane had a habit that made attendants both wary and curious. She could sit silently for hours beside her embroidery frame without uttering a word, her slender hands moving the needle rhythmically like a machine. Rumors spread that she was not embroidering roses, but prayers, stitching them into fabric to cleanse the palace of the dark aura left by her predecessor. She had the ability to listen without responding, a rare skill in a court where everyone wanted to shout in order to assert their position. The private meeting between Henry and Jane took place in the king's small reading chamber, where the heat from the fireplace could not dispel the chill in the heart of a monarch who had just passed his mid-40s. Henry was 44 years old in 1536. By this time, he had begun to feel the heaviness of his body and the pain from his chronic leg wound, the injury he had suffered years earlier in a jousting accident in 1536 that would never fully heal. He did not see Jane as a new conquest, but as a refuge. When she knelt before him, her movements were so gentle that not a single rustle came from her silk gown. Henry touched Jane's hand. It was icy cold, yet steady. He searched her face for signs of pride or ambition, but found only absolute submission. "Are you not afraid of me?" Henry asked, his voice rough. Jane lifted her eyes toward him, a gaze deep yet stripped of all personal ambition. "Your Majesty, I was born to obey and serve. In obedience, there is no room for fear." In Jane, Henry found something Anne had never given him: control. And was a challenge, a never-ending hunt that exhausted him. Jane was a bomb. She did not debate theology, did not interfere in politics with sharp words. She simply existed there, like a cool plaster statue, ready to absorb every outburst of rage and every moment of his loneliness. Jane's silence was not a lack of intelligence, but a supreme survival strategy. She understood that after a violent storm, people do not need another storm. They need a calm lake in which they can see their own reflection. And Henry, a man who constantly craved to see his own authority and greatness reflected back at him, found that perfect mirror in Jane Seymour. Instead of expensive perfumes from Italy or France, Jane always carried the scent of dried lavender and pure beeswax, a fragrance reminiscent of monastic purity, the very thing Henry longed for in order to cleanse his soul. Whenever Henry mentioned the names Anne or Catherine, Jane unconsciously played with the silver ring on her left hand, as if performing a ritual to calm herself or to ward off old spirits. At times, while speaking with the king, Jane would stare fixedly into a dark corner of the room, as though observing someone unseen. This created an eerie atmosphere that made Henry feel both unsettled and irresistibly drawn to her mysterious nature. If Anne Boleyn was a blazing sun that forced people to squint, Jane Seymour was a gentle moonlight that made people lower their guard. Jane understood clearly that Henry was exhausted by sharp debates and strong personalities. She chose a different path, absolute obedience. Her motto, bound to obey and serve, was not merely a phrase embroidered on a ribbon, but a velvet-covered suit of armor. While the court expected the new queen to fill Anne's absence with lavish feasts and splendor, Jane chose to erase herself. She moved lightly, spoke so softly that others had to lean toward her to hear her, a subconscious gesture that awakened a protective instinct in those around her. There was a little-known mysterious detail about Jane during this period. She had a peculiar hobby of collecting small, empty wooden boxes. She arranged them on her dressing table, opening and closing them as if storing wordless secrets. Some believed that each box represented one of Henry's secrets that she had heard but vowed never to repeat. This was how she created an absolute sense of safety for a king who lived in constant fear of betrayal. Only 11 days after Anne Boleyn's death, the engagement took place, and on May 30th, 1536, Jane officially became queen at Whitehall Palace. There was no grand coronation, no long processions through the streets of London. The wedding unfolded quickly and with an eerie quietness. Henry wanted a new beginning without ripples. In her simple ivory-white wedding gown, Jane looked more like a nun than a queen. A remarkable detail, instead of wearing the dazzling jewels once owned by Anne, Jane demanded that they be remade. She refused to use any object associated with her predecessor. She ordered goldsmiths to melt down the old gold and recast it into simpler, purer forms. This convinced Henry that she was truly cleansing the court of its former sins. The most powerful weapon Jane used to win Henry's heart was not beauty, but her effort to heal the relationship between the king and his eldest daughter, Mary Tudor, the daughter of Catherine of Aragon. At that time, Mary was living in disgrace. She had been stripped of her title as princess and forced to serve her younger half-sister Elizabeth. Jane, whether out of innate compassion or sharp political insight, perceived Henry's hidden pain. He loved his daughter, but the pride of a king would not allow him to bow before a stubborn child. Jane secretly wrote letters to Mary, advising her to temporarily submit to her father. She did not hesitate to kneel before Henry, not for herself, but to plead for Mary's forgiveness. People saw Jane frequently embroidering handkerchiefs with the intertwined initials M and H, Mary and Henry, and deliberately leaving them in places where Henry could easily notice them. She did not speak. She allowed silence and small symbols to influence the king's subconscious. Eventually, the historic reconciliation between father and daughter took place at the palace in tears. Henry saw in Jane a gentle mother for his kingdom, a woman who did not seek power for herself, but stability for the royal house. Yet beneath Jane's display of kindness, there were moments that sent chills down people's spines. She had a habit of standing motionless in the shadows of embroidered curtains, watching maidservants as they whispered among themselves. She never scolded them. She simply stared with those pale blue eyes until they fell silent in fear. She established a new order even stricter than Anne Boleyn's. Revealing gowns were banned. Overly passionate dances were eliminated. Under Jane Seymour, the court became as quiet as a chapel. It was precisely this extreme contrast that made Henry believe he had finally found a true wife, a woman perfectly suited to become the mother of the heir he had long desired. Jane ordered all mirrors in her bedroom to be covered with white silk, except for a small one used for dressing. She said that a queen should not look at herself too often, lest pride be born. A psychological strike aimed directly at Henry's hatred of vanity after the Anne Boleyn affair. Jane often gave Henry bouquets of pressed wildflowers instead of jewelry. She wanted him to remember the simplicity of the English countryside, where the Seymour family originated, creating the image of a pure girl next door. Jane had a habit of washing her hands with rose water many times a day, as if she were trying to cleanse some invisible stain clinging to this court. Although Whitehall Palace was now filled with the scent of lavender and the sound of prayers, Jane never forgot that she was walking across a minefield of history. Every time she passed the corridor leading to the Queen's chamber, she seemed to hear the proud footsteps of Anne Boleyn and the weary breath of Catherine of Aragon. The pressure to bear a son was not a request, it was a suspended sentence. Jane understood clearly that at Henry VIII's court, the Queen's womb was the battlefield. If she failed to produce a male heir, her silence and obedience would quickly be dismissed as dullness and uselessness. It was said that in the early period, Jane secretly placed small parchment slips beneath her pillow, copying passages from the Bible about fertility and multiplication. More mysteriously, she developed a habit of counting pebbles. Every morning, she picked up a small stone from the gardens of Hampton Court and dropped it into a porcelain jar. She told herself that if the jar was full before her next menstrual cycle, God would grant her a son. This obsession with numbers and repetition revealed a mind stretched to its limits beneath an outwardly calm facade. When the first signs of pregnancy appeared in early 1537, Henry VIII seemed to grow 10 years younger. To him, this was not merely a child, but a divine confirmation that this marriage was legitimate and holy. Henry began calling Jane the only true wife. It was an invisible cruelty toward his two previous wives, but the highest praise he could offer Jane. He regarded her as a living saint. Henry issued an order that no one was allowed to disturb the Queen. He controlled everything she ate and everywhere she went. When Jane casually mentioned that she craved quail, Henry immediately ordered his envoys in Calais, France, to hunt down the finest quail, transport them across the English Channel, and deliver them to her table as quickly as possible. Jane was required to rest in rooms flooded with light, surrounded by the most exquisite tapestries. Henry often sat at her feet, resting his head on her belly to listen to the heartbeat of the future of England, neglecting important political reports from Thomas Cromwell. As the final months approached, Henry's indulgence became a suffocating burden for Jane. In his eyes, she no longer saw love for a woman, but worship of the child in her womb. Jane developed a strange and somewhat extreme habit. She demanded that all red objects be removed from her sight, from red roses in vases to ribbons on maidservants' dresses. Red reminded her of blood, the blood spilled on the scaffold of Anne, and the blood she feared she might lose during childbirth. She wanted to surround herself only with white, gold, and blue, the color of the Virgin Mary. In letters to her brother Edward Seymour, Jane sometimes revealed trembling lines. "May God grant that the child be a son, or else I do not know where I shall disappear within this palace." She began to dream strange dreams of crowns made of ice melting in her hands. Not only Henry, but the entire nation of England held its breath with every step Jane took. Astrologers were ordered to cast horoscopes for the unborn child. Every sign pointed to a boy. Jane became the focus of prayers across churches throughout the kingdom. Yet amid the glory, she grew thinner by the day, except for her ever-growing belly. She ate very little, often only white bread and pure spring water. She seemed to be trying to keep herself clean, both literally and symbolically, to receive the gift of God. Jane's silence was no longer a weapon, but a form of endurance. She had become a prisoner of the king's favor. Each time she looked out the window toward the River Thames, she no longer saw a vast kingdom, but a single narrow path leading to the day of birth, the day that would determine whether she would be the savior of the dynasty or merely another name in the list of unfortunate wives. Mary Tudor often sat beside Jane, reading to her. Two women, one cast aside, the other at the peak of favor, found empathy in their shared fear of Henry's unpredictable temperament. Henry ordered all sharp edges of furniture in Jane's rooms to be wrapped in soft cloth, to ensure she would not suffer even the slightest scratch. Jane asked musicians to play extremely slow and somber melodies, believing that lively music would make the child in her womb rebellious, like Elizabeth's mother, Anne Boleyn. In October 1537, Hampton Court Palace was enveloped in thick fog rising from the Thames. Inside the birthing chamber, sealed with heavy tapestries to block drafts, Jane Seymour began her battle for survival. Childbirth was not a medical event, but a terrifying religious ritual. According to the customs of the time, the Queen's chamber had to be sealed, windows closed, candles lit, and the air thick with the scent of herbs mixed with sweat. Jane was confined in that suffocating space for 2 days and 3 nights. Time was no longer measured in hours, but in contractions that tore through Jane's fragile body. Physicians and midwives began to panic. They whispered about extreme measures, about choosing the mother or the child. A question that Henry VIII, hearing it from behind the door, answered in a cold but resolute voice. Save the child at any cost, for wives can be found anywhere. That sentence, whether literal or symbolic, sealed Jane's fate. Amid delirium from exhaustion and pain, Jane developed a habit that chilled those who witnessed it. She began singing lullabies in ancient Latin. Fragmented, mournful melodies escaped her cracked lips. She did not call Henry's name. She called her mother's name, and sometimes, in fever, people heard her whisper, "Catherine," the first wife who had died in solitude. Perhaps in the moment closest to death, Jane felt a strange bond with the women who had walked this path of suffering before her. At dawn on October 12, 1537, the feast day of St. Edward, a sharp, piercing cry shattered the oppressive atmosphere of Hampton Court. A boy, a healthy and legitimate male heir. When the news was announced, the entire palace seemed to explode. Henry VIII, the man who had waited for this moment for 27 years, collapsed to his knees in the corridor. Henry wept. Tears rolled down the face already marked by age and cruelty. He believed Edward's cry was absolution from heaven. God was no longer punishing him for breaking his marriage with Catherine or for shedding Anne's blood. Edward was proof that he was still the chosen one. He rushed into the chamber, ignoring the smell of blood and Jane's exhaustion, caring only to embrace his son. In that moment, Jane Seymour saw her husband not as a king, but as a child who had just recovered a lost soul. Jane lay there, her face pale as velvet paper, her once light eyes now almost transparent. She smiled, a smile of someone who had completed her sentence. When the baby was placed in her arms, she gently touched Edward's tiny hand and whispered a blessing that no one could hear. After giving birth, though she was so exhausted that she could barely lift her arms, Jane asked her attendants to cleanse her hands with red wine. She said that rose water was no longer enough to wash away the pain of the dynasty. It was a haunting symbolic act, as if she were using wine, the blood of Christ, to cleanse the cruel destiny of a king's wife. Despite physicians' warnings that she needed absolute rest, Jane insisted on fulfilling her final duty, appearing at Edward's christening. In a scene both magnificent and heartbreaking, Jane was placed on a litter draped in gold velvet, surrounded by hundreds of blazing candles. She appeared before the entire court, wearing the heaviest ceremonial gown, concealing the truth that her body was bleeding and postpartum fever was beginning to burn from within. She watched Mary Tudor carry the child in her arms, watched Henry radiant as he received congratulations. Jane stood there like a living saint, receiving the worship of an entire kingdom. But those closest to her realized that her gaze no longer belonged to this world. She had given all her remaining strength to that baptism, to the official recognition of her son's status. That night, when she was returned to her bed, Jane Seymour fell into a deep sleep from which she would never truly awaken again. She had completed her contract with the Tudor dynasty at the highest possible price. All of London fell silent, waiting for the thunder from the tower to declare the baby's sex. And when it came, more than 2,000 gunshots fired from the Tower of London to herald a prince. The city erupted into light, bonfires roaring through the night like a second sunrise. Right after Edward was born, Henry presented Jane with a necklace set with what he proclaimed to be the kingdom's greatest diamond. But Jane only held it for a moment, then let it slip from her fingers and fall to the floor, as if wealth had suddenly become meaningless to her. One midwife later swore that on the night Edward arrived, a white falcon and Boleyn's symbol landed on Jane's windowsill, cried out 3 times, and vanished into the dark. A ghostly detail, as if the past was still watching, refusing to leave. Less than 48 hours after Edward's lavish christening on October 15th, 1537, the celebration at Hampton Court froze in place. Jane Seymour, just crowned by the court as the dynasty's savior, began to tremble beneath layers of fur blankets. Childbed fever, the most merciless invisible enemy of women in that era, had found her. Her body burned like a furnace, yet she kept crying that she was cold. The physicians, desperate, tried everything they knew, bloodletting, rare herbs brought from afar, but Jane no longer seemed to want to fight. She had poured the last of her strength into the moment Edward was baptized. In delirium, Jane no longer held the stillness that had defined her. Her hands moved constantly, weaving invisible threads through the air. She muttered about embroidering a tiny cloak made of light for Edward. More terrifying, she would jolt awake and whisper, "Is the door locked? Can she get in?" She never said who she was, but everyone understood. She was haunted by Anne Boleyn, the woman whose crown had been taken so Jane could wear it. Henry VIII, the man who believed himself God's representative on earth, who could decide life and death for thousands with a single signature, collapsed completely. He stood beside Jane's bed, watched her face twist with convulsions, and realized his crown was useless against death's sickle. For the first time, the court saw Henry weak. He didn't rage. He didn't threaten the physicians. He simply sat there, gripping Jane's thinning hand, repeating again and again, "You can't leave me, Jane. I gave you everything. I gave you a kingdom." But Jane answered only with distant, unanchored eyes. To her, the kingdom had already drifted beyond reach. Henry ordered that no bells be rung inside the palace or nearby, terrified that the sound would wake Jane's spirit and call it away. He tried to smother Hampton Court in absolute silence, silence like Jane herself, as if he could hold her in the world by wrapping her in her own nature. On the night of October 24th, 1537, Jane Seymour exhaled her last breath. The palace fell into a terrifying quiet. Her death, at that exact moment, tragic as it was, became the fate that made her immortal. She died at the peak of Henry's favor, before he could grow bored, before she could make a political misstep, and most crucially, after she had completed the mission of giving him Edward. Jane Seymour did not die like a discarded wife. She died like a martyr saint of the Tudor dynasty. She became the eternal, perfect wife because she never had the chance to age, never had the chance to argue with Henry one more time. In Henry's paranoia-soaked mind, Jane was preserved forever in the purity and total obedience of 1537. Before her body was prepared, people saw Jane gripping a small lock of Edward's hair in her hand. Henry ordered that it not be removed, that she should carry it into the grave. He believed that way, Jane would guard his heir from the other side. Jane's death cut Henry so deeply that he wore black for 3 straight months, an act seen as unprecedented in its intensity. He fled attention, shut himself inside dark rooms, and stared only at Jane's image. She was the only woman who made his iron heart truly bleed from loss, not from rage, not from betrayal. A maid later found beneath Jane's pillow an unfinished letter addressed to Mary Tudor, urging her to watch over Edward's servants. Proof that even in fever, her protective instinct for her child remained fierce. People said that after Jane died, her chamber still reeked of lavender for months. Even after it was scrubbed clean, an eerie legend that her presence refused to fade. Henry looked at Jane's closed eyes and understood that from now on, he would face the world alone, without the only refuge that had ever truly quieted him. Jane Seymour's death left a black void inside Whitehall. Henry VIII, once famous for glittering cloth of gold outfits and lavish feasts, changed abruptly. He wore black, normally reserved for brief mourning rituals, for 3 consecutive months. The extravagance vanished. In its place came a silence that felt almost supernatural. Henry stopped hunting. He stopped hosting dances. He sat alone in the dark, in front of Jane's portrait. Jane, whose face had been fixed in royal memory by the imagery of Hans Holbein's court, murmuring words no one could fully understand. Some claimed he was apologizing to her for driving her body into ruin to produce his son. At meals after Jane's death, Henry ordered an empty chair to remain beside him, set with spotless silver. No one was allowed to sit there, and sometimes people saw him tilt his head slightly, as if listening to a whisper coming from nothingness. He began to believe that although Jane's body lay in the tomb, her spirit remained his most silent advisor. Henry VIII took 3 more wives after Jane, but none could replace her. And when Henry's final breath left him in 1547, his last wish stunned England. He wanted to be buried at St. George's Chapel, Windsor, beside Jane Seymour. Why not Catherine of Aragon, the wife of 20 years? Why not Anne Boleyn, the woman he once tore faith itself apart to possess? The reason wasn't only that Jane gave him Edward. Jane was the only one who died while Henry's love for her was still at its brightest. She never had the time to disappoint him, never had the time to grow old, never had the time to defy him. In the mind of a selfish, paranoid man like Henry, Jane became the symbol of unconditional sacrifice, the only woman who gave him everything without demanding political power for herself. Jane Seymour did not only leave a successor to the Tudor dynasty, she left a standard no woman after her could surpass. Henry's later wives, an unexciting and of Cleves, a reckless Catherine Howard, a brilliant Catherine Parr, were forced to live under the shadow of the White Lily. Years after Jane died, Henry commissioned a dynastic family image, the family of Henry VIII, created around 1545, and in that picture, the queen beside him is not the wife he had at the time, but Jane Seymour, youthful, eternal, while Edward stands beside his father. Jane became the ghost wife, who remained with Henry for the rest of his life. Jane Seymour entered history not through brilliance or fiery speeches. She won through endurance, through the ability to turn herself into a mirror reflecting exactly what Henry craved to see in himself: holiness, authority, and the future. She was the only woman who forced Henry VIII, who treated women like pieces on a board, to confront his own weakness. Jane Seymour, the beloved wife, lies there under the cold stone of Windsor, keeping sleep over her tyrant king forever. She was not only a queen of a kingdom, she was the queen of the only peaceful memory in the storm of Henry's life. What do you think Jane was truly feeling when she witnessed Henry's cruelty toward others? And how did she hide her disgust behind the mask of obedience? If you enjoy this kind of deep psychological exploration and the historical mysteries surrounding Henry VIII's most beloved wife, leave a comment and tell me what you felt, or tell me which queen you want me to unpack next. Your engagement is the reason I keep building stories like this.